you what we said, what the debate back and forth was, and then you just pitch me questions about how I can clarify that. Does that work?
Yeah. Yep. I just
So
realized I don't think I was actually streaming that part, but yeah, we're good now. Okay, let's go.
Okay, we're live now. Got it. Good to go.
Yeah.
So we were talking in our chat about the report, and this is an old report. This is from late August about BAE, establishing its local presence, and I'm being very careful to quote them word for word. Establishing local presence and signing agreements to support Ukraine. BAE, for those who don't know, British Aerospace Engineering, as it was formerly known, it's the primary defense contracting company of the UK. They have a very large presence in both Gulf Cooperation Council markets, so Persian Gulf, Saudi, Qatar, UAE, etc., as well as in the US in terms of joint ventures, as well, and primary in developing several, especially aerospace platforms, airframe platforms that have been used by the UK and EU. Their role is listed or is described in their statements as being and I believe it's £5 to £6 million investment. And one of the things I was talking to Constantine about is, right, it says £5 to £6 million. This is a big risk for them beyond that headline figure. And this is, to be very clear, this is back of the envelope math. I've got their last quarterly statements up in front of me. They don't break it down very much. So this is back of the envelope math, but I've been doing this for 20 years of my career. So take that for what it's worth. This is probably close to, if not exceeding, £100 million net risk investment for them. But it's one that I think that if I put myself in the position of a BAE board member, i.e. a shareholder, I think it's worth taking for them, even if it doesn't work out. It's high risk, right? Obviously, it's going to be a target, no matter where it is. If you put infrastructure domestically into Ukraine, it's going to be a target. And you have to plan for the possibility that you wake up tomorrow and it's gone, or it's essentially offline for the foreseeable future, requiring a huge amount of CapEx to bring back online. It's a good call for them, because their main clients who are paying them the huge contracts, whether it's Eurofighter contracts, whether it is, literal combat ship systems, they have a very long history with Lockheed Martin, whether it's F-35, same contractor, whether it's Boeing as their JV of choice, and whether it's, future aerospace opportunities for the UK that they're developing in coordination with Italy and Japan, possibly Saudi Arabia. This kind of staying power is something that your contracting partners are going to look at. And even if it is, as I would believe, like, the real figure here in terms of total, including opportunity cost, it's in the 9 figures. It's over £100 million. I think it's a good deal for them. That's my opening spiel.
Yeah, that's so I guess my question is, what is the investment even in? Like, what are they investing in? Like, what is the purpose?
All right, so let's bring up and this is where it would be great if I'd actually put this in like a nest or had sent you the statement. Do you have the statement link that you can put up on the stream? If not, we can link it in the description. It's very, very vague, by the way. It's not like as if they go into great detail, but it's talking, it's focused primarily on facilitating the production of 105 millimeter light guns, is what the statement says. And there's any number of JVs that are attached to that, JV being joint venture. So, dual use infrastructure within the military industrial production sector. I assume, and this is not disclosed, and it's obviously not disclosed for a reason, because this is all, highly confidential state security information. I assume that there's a lot more to it than that. That's been the case in defense contracts that I've had familiarity with in the past, especially around, different delivery programs rather than procurement programs. specifically if you looked at East Asia, what's being delivered to East Asia, Republic of China, South Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, what's being delivered there from the U.S., the investments that are being made in delivery rather than procurement are fairly flexible. But my main point that I was making to you on chat, making to Constantine is, they're not going to tell us exactly what's being put in place and exactly what it's used for and could be used for. But what we can reasonably guess at is that, this investment is going to be counted on as being there by multiple parties. So whether it is, quote unquote, facilitating the production of 105mm guns, it's probably also going to have other aspects for similar systems. And whether that means, M777s, whether that means something as far afield as, chassis for armored vehicles that can be delivered. It's something that there's, other delivering companies have put assets on their balance sheet towards this system being in place that BAE is creating. I know that sounds like I'm being intentionally vague. I'm just mirroring the intentional vagueness of their statement.
If I could add some context to that, so obviously beyond the explicit reference to the M119 105mm howitzers that was in the statement itself, Ukraine has separately signaled interest in licensing production in some capacity through some mechanism of CV90. Approximately 1,000 of them was the figure that's been cited publicly by various Ukrainian government figures. They're looking at it as a joint venture with Slovakia for them to both jointly license, produce components of the CV90 under license in both countries, and then potentially for Ukraine in particular, I believe, to procure 1,000 units of that system in total. So beyond the howitzers, there's a pretty considerable portfolio that the Ukrainians are looking at with BAE. That's just what's in the public purview.
And in terms of what they're saying in public, I am not a defense industry expert, and there are people who have firsthand experience of the defense industry on this chat. So I will defer to them on exactly how it works, what the flexibility is. But what I do know more broadly is that downstream investments are going to be more flexible than upstream investments, which is, to use a comparison, you can't change a Ford car manufacturing plant to make Nissan cars very easily, but you can change a Ford dealership to sell Nissan cars fairly easily. That's the upstream, downstream, difference that I'm talking about. And so this is obviously going to be quite a downstream investment in terms of the production chain. And so it's going to be more flexible than it would be upstream.
Well, what I would add to that is that, legally speaking, BAE is going to have considerable obligations when it comes to some of these assets and some of the capacity that they can put into producing them in terms of whatever volume they already have contractually on order with various customers across the globe. A lot of this is going to depend on their ability to be able to expand their operations in certain areas, obviously in Ukraine, while still, putting requisite resources to meeting those contractual deadlines. We've seen this come up with a number both of national governments as well as private defense companies when it comes to providing systems to Ukraine, either as donations or to fulfill commercial orders. That a kind of an overriding obstacle has been that need to, meet existing contractual obligations. So there's likely, this is going to be a very long-term effort because of that. This is not something that BAE can do on a dime.
I completely agree. And you touched on one of the very key points, which is there are few industries that are more regulated than the defense industry. And very, very, very little can be changed or shifted on a dime in the defense industry because of those regulations, which are there for very good reasons, obviously. And so it's important that, we take the publicly available data, we take the public statements, and we can draw reasonable conclusions, but always taken with a very large grain of salt about how difficult it is to do things like JVs, do things like supply chain cooperation in this particular industry. I used the analogy before about auto manufacturing. This is not auto manufacturing. It's much, much more complicated from a regulatory point of view.
And I guess this is one of the things that I think, potentially makes Ukraine, from the standpoint of either licensing production or setting up local subsidiaries in country. I think this is something that potentially makes Ukraine perhaps more attractive in some sense than, say, doing this in the UK, the US, or another European country. Is the personnel aspect of it. That's come up constantly in discussions I've had with, friends and contacts in industry regarding U.S. efforts to potentially scale production in a number of areas to meet, both short, medium, as well as long-term Ukrainian needs. Is that particularly in terms of personnel, skilled engineers in these very specialized fields, technicians, etc. They don't grow on trees. So if there is an existing Ukrainian, pool of human resources, if you will, in terms of, qualified Ukrainian engineers, technicians, those with other relevant technical backgrounds that can be, kind of really nurtured and matured into, and expanded into being able to do this locally, that is potentially very beneficial for them because it really eases their burden from the standpoint of from the human perspective of scaling production and setting up new capacity.
And in terms of their balance sheet, so I've got their last quarterly statement up in front of me, and this is a company that lives and dies on state contractors, whether that's Saudi Arabia, the UK, or the US. And so operating profit for the last period, it's 1.2 billion. Net sales is 12 billion. A $5-6 million investment, prima facie, is a rounding error. It could disappear tomorrow, and on its face, it means nothing. But taking the lead on this effort, where it makes a difference to policy planners and procurement officers in the Pentagon, in the MOD, that makes a big difference in terms of the bread and butter contracts they hope to win over the next decade. And if you're on the board of BAE, that's what's in the back of your mind on every decision you make, is how does this X decision position us as a firm to win a contract from DoD especially, or MOD, or the Saudis, or elsewhere in the GCC over the next 10 to 15 years. It's a very long-term industry dependent on single contracts.
That issue I find interesting, and we have a question in the comment section about Rheinmetall, and they seem to be doing the same sort of calculus and investing in Ukraine. I don't know if you know much about Rheinmetall, but
So I know there was the Rheinmetall conversation going on in our chat earlier, and I didn't get a chance to look at the details. I know obviously Rheinmetall's very involved in the defense industry. They also have a lot of other businesses, and so they have more flexibility is the one thing I would say. But there's definitely, I know John and I know Konstantin have very, very granular knowledge on what Rheinmetall is doing in Ukraine, and I have cursory knowledge on that at best, so I'll defer to them.
Right. So I'm, Konstantin wants to add something on, he can go ahead. But what I'd just say briefly is Rheinmetall's involvement. I'm not sure if we've gotten a specific value figure in dollars or euros or what have you for the investments they're making into Ukraine. But at least on its surface, the infrastructure investment, just in terms of what they're actually aiming to achieve, looks very significant. I would be shocked if it wasn't if that didn't work out to a valuation that significantly exceeds what BAE has committed to thus far, Rheinmetall has committed to eventually setting up a joint venture with UOP, Ukroboronprom, Ukraine's state defense concern, to set up a local production of the Fuchs armored personnel carrier. I believe that's a two-phase project. Phase one will refurbish and repair. We'll set up a plant that will be able to perform repair work as well as refurbish existing Fuchs from industrial inventory in Germany as well as Bundeswehr inventory. So to kind of lay the groundwork for future donations from the German government of that platform. And then phase two will shift to being able to fully produce those vehicles from scratch in Ukraine. I believe the production capacity target is 400 units annually. The word on the street, based upon some reporting from various German media outlets, is that the Ukrainians are looking at a 4 to 5 digit order. So the Ukrainian government is interested in ordering somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 of these armored personnel carriers. So that's potentially a very sizable portfolio for Rheinmetall to make investments in. Beyond that, I believe there are either 2 or 3 other joint ventures, all with UOP as well. They are setting up facilities to be able to maintain, service, and repair various Rheinmetall air defense assets, the Gepard, amongst other things. There has been discussion of localized production of various air defense assets. It hasn't really been disclosed what those are as of yet. There was discussion of that KF-51 Panther prototype main battle tank. I think that's kind of fizzled out for various reasons because the product's just not technologically mature, but there was talk of that, although I think Rheinmetall has shifted their plans to Hungary for that specific investment. But just kind of, it's a really large investment infrastructure as far as can be seen. Oh, and the other thing was beyond that, we haven't really seen much action on this front, but Rheinmetall's CEO had referenced that they were very strongly looking at a proposal to take either 1 or 2 old Soviet armor fighting vehicle production plants in Ukraine that were still reasonably well equipped, and then spooling up 1 to 2 production lines for a undisclosed variety of main battle tank. That sounds to me like they'd be interested in producing either the T-64 in Ukraine, which would be a interesting choice, or potentially the T-84, because, and I infer that from the fact they're looking for well-equipped plants, because if you're going to produce a totally, Western main battle tank in a Ukrainian plant, just buy the empty building, because you're going to have to replace all the tooling and manufacturing infrastructure in there anyways. So it's a pretty big potential investment book there for them.
Yeah, and just as like an aside, we've seen a lot more of the Ukrainian-built tanks in combat recently, and I don't think they're just now entering combat, but I just find it interesting as it seems that there's very intentional messaging going on there, and it's just something I've noticed over the past week or two.
What's interesting on that front is, so as of a couple months ago, I believe it was Ukrainska Pravda did a very good investigative journalism piece about some of the stuff that was going on at UOP, primarily with the prior director, prior to the current one that was recently appointed a month or 2 ago. They had run into some issues. I believe as of midway through this year, they had zero capacity, if that reporting is to be believed, to produce any kind of main battle tank. And that was an issue because the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense was issuing contracts for the production of the T-84, despite UOP having no capacity to actually manufacture them. So, yeah, there's issues that need to be resolved there, obviously.
Okay. You sent me an article that I can't open.
Oh, you can't open that? Apologies. I'll send you a gifted version of that article. Hold on one second. I don't know if that actually helps because it'll be gifted to you, but it wouldn't be gifted to people who follow you. While I'm talking about that, and I'm sharing, giving access to non-subscriber, copying link, sending it to Andrew. In terms of Rheinmetall, it's just, it's helpful to get a sense of scale. Rheinmetall as an entire going concern is by most metrics about half the size of BAE. And Rheinmetall has very diverse interests, and BAE does not. And so when we're talking about these two companies, it's just important to keep that sense of scale where a number that may be material to Rheinmetall in its defense portfolio, which is a small portfolio relative to its other businesses, would be absolutely insignificant to BAE. And vice versa, in terms of a number that's very significant to BAE would, by definition, be incredibly significant to Rheinmetall, who makes a good chunk of its money through industrial customers rather than defense customers, whereas BAE has exclusively defense customers. And I've sent you that link. Hopefully, you can access that.
Oh, yeah, I got it. I got it here. And I put the link in the description of the video as well. Obviously, it's not the shared version. It's just the normal link.
If you use the exact URL I sent you, according to my understanding of the terms of service of my subscription, it will be accessible to anyone who clicks that link for 24 hours.
That's cool. Fingers
crossed. Knock on wood. Otherwise, I'll have to fly to Tokyo and read them the Riot Act.
Okay.
If you want me to talk on this, I'm happy to, by the way, on the semiconductor issue. I don't know if you wanted to do more on BAE and Rheinmetall.
Well, there is one concern that is obvious about investing in Ukraine, and that's the constant threat of being attacked with missiles, namely, but I guess also Shaheds. So that is the obvious concern, investing in a country that's at war with an adversary that can attack anywhere within the border of the country, basically, with cruise missiles. So,
on those along those lines, put yourself in the position of a BAE board member. You represent, say, a pension fund, right? Who has to invest a certain amount in BAE because it's a certain amount of an index. You're therefore a significant shareholder. You sit on the board. So you have no view either way about whether BAE is good or bad, defense is good or bad, but you have to be there. You're completely true neutral. How do you evaluate the risk of investing in Ukraine? So BAE in the past has supplied Saudi Arabia with armaments, with airframes, with armaments, with weapon systems. And there's a risk that your investment in infrastructure could be negated. Not that they invested much infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, it was mostly just system delivery, but still there's some infrastructure. Could be negated by, say, a Houthi missile strike. Compare that to the risk that your investment in infrastructure, i.e., plants, property, and equipment in Ukraine, is going to be negated, taken offline, completely destroyed, whatever it may be, by a Russian missile strike. It's night and day. This is not a familiar operating environment for you. Right? Supplying Typhoons and supplying M777s to Ukraine is not a comparable economic exercise, regardless of the military implications. But you have to weigh that participation against the value of future contracts, because you know that DoD, which is at the end of the day number one, and MOD number two, and GCC number three, are going to be assigning contracts based on reliability first and foremost. And it's very political, and it's not just economic. If you were selling widgets into the US market, people would buy the cheapest widget that works well. You're not selling widgets. You're selling airframes, you're selling munition systems, you're selling weapons platforms. People care about reliability. And so participating in this effort on behalf of MOD, DoD, not GCC in this instance, but more broadly, is going to earn you contracts down the line where EADS may not earn those contracts. So that's the calculus in the boardroom at BAE.
The other thing that I'd add is that there, to some extent, BAE has a bit of a captive market in the sense that they've obviously already received a number of BAE produced systems, and 777 being the most notable. Those require maintenance, sustainment, repair work, various other support services. From the U.S. perspective, there's two ways that can happen. Well, primarily two ways that can happen. The first is a foreign military sale that either includes a sustainment support package as part of it, or in Ukraine's case, since they did not acquire these M777s initially via the normal FMS process, they would be doing a separate FMS action to essentially just buy a support and sustainment package from the US DoD. That's one of the long-term paths that they would go down, is more or less the DoD, the Ukrainians would directly interface with the DoD to provide support, maintenance, and all the stuff, and the DoD would act as an intermediary and interface with BAE to then procure the services that are necessary for that to occur. Eventually, the Ukrainians are going to want to transition that to a DCS package, so a direct commercial sale, where they are directly procuring that support and sustainment from BAE itself, rather than through the intermediary of the U.S. Department of Defense. And they want to do this for various reasons, mainly because in many cases it's cheaper because you have to deal with all these ancillary costs that come with having the U.S. government as an intermediary for any of these contracts, etc. But that's going to be the model that they eventually want to transition to. And either way, BAE is going to be getting a contract, and having those facilities set up in Ukraine best positions them to be able to service those potential future DCS contracts. And it's the same thing with the other equipment that Ukraine has either received or will receive. I mean, it's inevitable that Lockheed Martin, for example, is going to set up shop in Ukraine at some point, at some scale, to be determined, obviously, at a minimum to support and sustain those F-16s that they're going to receive. So, there's going to be, the Ukrainian government is going to have an ongoing need, through the indefinite future, to place contracts for many of these services. And, it's really, again, it's a captive market for these, defense companies. They want to be well positioned to be able to service those contracts when they do arise.
Just following up on John's point, it's not a coincidence that the first bullet point in BAE's quarterly earnings looking forward statement, like their view, how things proceed, number one, is the outlook for our U.S. government services sector is robust with the opportunity for midterm growth. And that underlines exactly what John just said, right? That in the medium term, these contracts that are for Ukraine but through DoD are going to be their bread and butter. And that, as John said, that will probably change at some point. But BA can probably book that for 2 to 3 years, or 2 to 3 fiscal years, and be honest in their communications with their shareholders. On John's other point about the F-16s, and this is something that I feel is, and I know that John knows this, I'm not trying to correct him, but I feel like this is misreported sometimes. Lockheed can service those F-16s in Poland at an efficiently effective rate in a way that BAE cannot do for the M777 in terms of their economics, not in terms of their battlefield efficacy, but in terms of their economics. And that's why you see BAE in Ukraine right now and not LMT.
Well, there's a difference there, and so there's
Exactly.
another level.
Right.
No,
It's airframes. It's airframes versus
that's
artillery, right?
No, that's not the nuance.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
The nuance that I'm getting at is, to some extent, Lockheed Martin isn't doing the servicing in Poland. The Department of Defense is. So Poland has their F-16s via an FMS contract and support services via an FMS contract. So while there is going to be Lockheed Martin infrastructure in Poland to help support that contract, Poland is contracted directly with the DoD for those services. So a large burden of that is going to fall on the DoD itself as the intermediary. So Ukraine would be moving, airframes, power plants, what have you, whatever needs to be serviced out of Ukraine into Poland to be serviced by the DoD itself in large part. Obviously, there will be a contractor, Lockheed Martin component directly to that. But long term, Ukraine is either going to need, directly have that DoD infrastructure in Ukraine, which will probably happen post-war, and then eventually they're going to want to transition that to Lockheed Martin infrastructure itself and interface directly with them, like most long-term users of, say, the F-16, tend to do, and that would be through the DCS process.
I agree with everything you just said. My only point is that in the near term, it's easier to service the M777s in Ukraine than it is to shift those services from Poland to Ukraine for the F-16. It's the less sticky option economically.
I would agree with that. Yes.
Yeah.
So we have a question. With companies investing in Ukraine, does that somehow incentivize everyone to drag the war out longer?
That's a great question. Can I take a minute on this one, Andrew?
Okay.
All right, I'll take a minute. So there was a very notorious Twitter thread. Maybe someone else on the stream can get it to Andrew while I talk. It's an RFK Twitter thread that was about Ukrainian land. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, please send it to Andrew. It's on my... I'll get it to you afterwards, either way. So it was this idea that RFK sent out, RFK Jr. being a now independent party presidential candidate in the U.S., in the spring, he sent out he quote tweeted a thread from a severely compromised think tank that said BlackRock et al., meaning Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, global banks, rootless cosmopolitans, parentheses, are taking control of Ukraine, and that's why they started this war. It's utter bullshit. More Ukrainian agricultural land is privately held rather than conglomerate held now versus 2019. And it is a trope that you see over and over and over again. So yes, you had BlackRock, which, by the way, is an asset manager. They do not take the alpha. They're not looking to gain or lose on the value of a proposition. They're looking for the beta, which is to charge someone a fee to give them the gain or loss on a position. And of course they're investing in Ukraine because there's incentives to invest in Ukraine, but it's not their money. They're facilitating others to invest in Ukraine. And everyone would benefit if you zoomed out to 30,000 feet from a cessation of hostilities. Without question. And this trope has been peddled with any number of dog whistles that, people want the war in Ukraine to continue. The only one that you could make a coherent argument for, it wouldn't be correct, but it would be coherent, is the defense industry. Because you could say, right, well, the defense industry, if this war continues longer than it otherwise would have, would get more contracts. Yeah, that's true, but there's many ways to get contracts, and the defense industry has not started wars for a long time. But outside of that, it's absolute BS. I'm happy to answer other questions on that. It's, so many people lost so much money because of this invasion that no one thought was going to happen in February 2022.
One thing I would say is that there's a very common myth that defense contractors make more money from war in wartime than they do in peacetime. And and it seems like something that you might think is obviously true, but the reality is it's not for the most part. And the reason for that is that research and development contracts are worth a lot of money, a massive amount of money. Production is usually worth quite a bit less. And what you tend to universally see across the board is when you transition from a peacetime to a wartime environment, the bulk of your contracting as a defense contractor transitions as well from being a really large volume of R&D to just manufacturing, to just sheer volume of manufacturing. That's not to say that R&D doesn't occur in wartime. It obviously does, but wartime R&D is very different than peacetime R&D. It tends to be much more focused, much more specific and niche, and much more short term, and focused on meeting, immediate operational needs within the next 1 to 2 years versus, say, developing something like the F-35 that's easily a 40, 50, 60 plus year, acquisitions program, R&D and production acquisition program, the whole thing, whole life cycle. So what that typically works out to in the end is that either the defense contractor at the end of the day transitioning, from a peacetime to a wartime environment is probably going to make the same amount of money. It's not going to have a massive effect on their bottom line. It will obviously have some effect, but the from first principles assumption that war is good for a defense contractor's business is not correct in general.
Absolutely correct. Right? It helps certain segments. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 helped sales for Javelin missiles and production orders for Javelin missiles, which mostly, but not exclusively, goes to Raytheon. But if you look at the defense sector as a whole, there were any number of R&D programs which would be spread out, as John said, over decades, which were canceled, delayed, postponed, etc. And it's a conflagration of inputs that determine how those companies make money and when. For anyone who thinks that this is all a military-industrial complex plot, and I know very few listeners of the stream will think that, but for those out there who do, look at Raytheon's stock 3 years to date. Look at Lockheed's stock 3 years to date. Look at Boeing's stock 3 years to date. They're not raking in the cash. It's been a massive redistribution of resources, but it has not been a windfall. Yeah, one segment got a windfall and another segment got their funding cut. Short term, yes, you had a massive windfall of orders that Raytheon profited from for Javelin missiles in early 2022. Look at Raytheon as a whole, all of their contracts, all of their obligations, and look at the defense industry as a whole, contracts and obligations. It's a very mixed bag.
Only other thing I'd add on to that is that in a wartime environment, really the only corporate entities that are well positioned to make profit well in excess of what they might generate in peacetime would be companies that aren't that involved in the defense sector, which is to say mainly companies that manufacture things whose primary business model is just manufacturing with not that much volume of R&D, that suddenly get, let's say you have a plant that makes, metal piping. Not much R&D there, mostly manufacturing volume. That's where they get the bulk of their revenue. The government transitioning that factory to producing a massive volume of shells, that might be an actually, a relative windfall for that company, depending on that depending on the investment that's necessary to make that, capacity transition from a metal pipe to a shell. But that's really the only type of company that you might reasonably expect to make a windfall from this type of event is manufacturing focused companies with, not considerable amounts of R&D in the books that are suddenly going to get very large manufacturing contracts without a major loss in revenue from R&D contracts.
The most famous example of that being ball bearing companies in the US during World War II. The most banal, boring product, but it became critical and immediately critical in 1941 in the US. And that was where you saw the largest, almost exponential growth in economic activity. It's not going to be in the tank manufacturing company. Not that the US had many of those in 1942, but I'm getting off topic.
Busy here, like Googling stuff as you talk. But anyways,
Sorry?
I was just here Googling stuff as you talk.
That wasn't me. That was someone else.
No, I mean I was like typing in
yeah.
like the stocks and stuff. I was like, what is the price of this stock?
No, I have my numbers. Don't worry. Every single one of those companies is either flat or slightly down.
Yeah.
Which, by the way,
yeah.
is fine. January 2020 to now. That's fine. They're neither massively outperforming or underperforming. But this idea that there's, a cabal that's orchestrating this conflict to, continue indefinitely when it could end now in order to gain profit, it's a ridiculous proposition if you just cared about the numbers. Never mind morality, never mind, legal consequences. If you just looked at the dollars and cents, it's a ridiculous proposition. They would make way more money with a slight threat that doesn't continue than they would with a persistent threat.
Yeah. When I remember the quote that I think everyone refers to, I think the quote was, "No one ever lost money selling guns during a war." I think that was the quote, right? It's not true because people have.
It's absolutely not true because people definitely have, and you can ask Soviet armaments manufacturers about how much money they lost selling AK-47s and RPG-3s to, various African regimes throughout the Cold War. And certainly the US arming any number of countries and then having them completely fold at the first sign of communist resistance during the Cold War.
Well, the great thing there is, because the Soviet ones were state-owned, the companies lost money. Ours, the U.S. government lost money. The private companies probably didn't.
Correct. You've identified one of the differences in the two systems. But either way, whether losses are socialized, privatized, there's still losses.
Anyways, John, do you have anything else to talk about regarding the BAE systems, etc.?
I don't, but I think somebody who might be able to speak to it more has joined us.
Yes, Serduchka, do you have anything to say that you, or can you say anything?
I don't know what's already been discussed. My apologies. Obviously, there's a lot of information flying around in the area right now outside of what's, and this is an absolute cop out of an answer, outside of what's already really in the public domain. There's not a lot that can really be said at the minute, other than, there's a lot of complexity around the local partnering agreements as you would expect, and watch this space. I appreciate that is the absolute worst fence-sitting answer I could possibly give, but it's about as far as we can really talk about at the moment.
All right.
Serdushka, one of the things we talked about earlier was the importance of ball bearings as a, on the surface, utterly banal, irrelevant component, but effectively critical component. And I know you know a lot about ball bearings, so I just wanted to ping you on that without putting you on the spot. I apologize.
Yeah, and I mean, basic CNC capability or precision CNC capability is a massive part of defense that I think when people talk about defense manufacturing, they think of the large output and the overall assembly rather than all the different components and sub-assemblies. And none of this manufacturing repair is going to take place without a significant investment in machining capability, which not to say the Ukrainian defense sector doesn't already have. There's a very very rich history and experience in sort of Ukrainian manufacturing, certainly for defense and complex aerospace. But as with all things to do with precision manufacturing, there's going to be aside from all of the questions about offset and responsibility and financing, there's going to be the question around whether or not any export legislation is going to get in the way. As with all good intentioned things, I like to think that certainly UK government has sorted itself out in that respect, but that would be putting a lot of faith in UK export authorities, which I think we're all sensible enough to not do from time to time. But yeah, it's a lot of the critical machining. I think it would make sense, be it ball bearings, be it plates and sub-assemblies, be it sacrificial block, whatever it may be that's going to be manufactured. It would make sense for it to all be done en masse out there, in light of the difficulty of sort of provision of a number of elements of military aid. Any of the pressure we can take off the logistics supply chain in terms of the manufacturing of sub-assemblies and components makes sense to do in country. So I'm wondering how much of it might be sort of full as subcomponent assembly, and that in sort of a offset manufacturing agreement, and then return for completion outside of country. Or there's a number of options that things could be. There's a number of things that are unknown. I think whatever the option is that's going to be delivered, I think it'll be interesting to see what it opens in terms of pathways for further involvement of Ukrainian defense manufacturing with some of the other major providers who are having various conversations.
Yeah, I was about to say, so on the U.S. side of things, obviously from U.S. export control law standpoint, there's obviously significant concern here regarding State Department approval for export of defense articles, be it the defense articles themselves or the intellectual property and technical data packages needed to manufacture them. That's all controlled by the Arms Export Control Act and ITAR, International Traffic in Arms regulations. So all of those sales or transfers are going to require U.S. State Department approval, and so that's kind of been a lingering concern here. Is the U.S. I'm not sure if heavy-handed would be the right word, but the State Department, the Department of Defense, National Security Council, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joint Chiefs of Staff, etc., all take a very active role in deciding what does and does not get exported to foreign states by U.S. defense companies, or even products by non-U.S. defense companies that contain American intellectual property. They're very active in that role, and so it remains to be seen whether or not Ukraine is going to get the export authorization for a number of these critical articles. Again, either the articles themselves or the IP needed to produce them.
And this is it. Allied countries like the UK have enough difficulties with PMRSAT before you're considering allied countries like Ukraine. There's so many moving parts to this going on behind the scenes. I've seen some rather fantastic takes on social media, as we all have, around, well, why can't we just do this? Why can't we do one of the best ones I've seen is, well, if we can do AUKUS, why can't we do something equivalent for Ukraine? there's some really wonderful takes, and I for one will be really interested to see how this sort of falls from a the licensing and authorization perspective. I'd be really interested to see whatever this MLA is going to end up looking like.
We have a lot of ball bearing related conversation in the chat now.
I apologize. I got that going.
Everyone just has a soft spot for ball bearings, you know?
Understandable, right? I think on Serdushka's point, by the way, why we couldn't get an AUKUS done for Ukraine. Well, I don't buy into that one-to-one comparison, and I don't think Serdushka does either, by the way. I think he was using that as a base case. I think that's one thing that's often overlooked. And, Stephen Kotkin, who's my, not only my former advisor, but also my North Star in terms of these issues, as he pointed out, a Western Ukraine is the ultimate definition of victory, right? Whatever the territorial issues, whatever the specific political issues, if you have a Ukraine that takes its part as the overwhelming majority of the population wish it to, as a part of Europe, as a part of the West, that's victory. If that is not allowed, even though the majority wish that to be the case, that is not victory. And using that as the litmus test. I don't think AUKUS is the perfect one-to-one, but it's pretty close. And you can bring up any number of statutory issues around NATO membership, around EU membership. But the nations of the quote-unquote West, which is, yes, obviously a misused term, yada, yada, yada. But whether it's the US, the UK, whether it's the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, whether it's Japan and the UK and the US, whatever combination or permutation you want to create, they have the ability and they have the political will to integrate Ukraine into the Western political economic infrastructure to some degree. And I think that's something that is overlooked at the price of specific targets like NATO membership, EU membership, which we should still go for, to be clear. But there are stops along the way that we can achieve in the meantime.
I'm going to be the dark horse here and say that I don't think that AUKUS is as remotely a good analogy for the type of relationship that we need to have with Ukraine, simply because AUKUS is, at its most basic level, addresses a very, very extremely specific need for United States of U.S. national security and defense policy, as well as Australian defense policy. It's a very specific and focused program to essentially be able to outsource submarine production because we can't produce as many as we would like, and as well as to give the Australians some way to be more relevant for Taiwan, just because of the distance. I don't think that's a good analogy. I can't think of a better one, unfortunately. But I don't think AUKUS is a good analogy.
I just want to clarify.
Don't forget screwing over the French, right? Screwing over the French is the key part of AUKUS.
That is fair.
I'll let Serdushka talk, and then I'll talk.
I can't see the stream comments. I just want to clarify that is also absolutely my view. My reference to AUKUS for Ukraine was calling out people who have got really, really shit takes about this online, who are obviously commenting about it because they've read the name of the proposed agreement in an article and don't understand how it works. Just for 100% clarity for anyone listening.
I think Serdushka, John, and I are all on the same page. AUKUS is a far from perfect, almost absurdly far from perfect comparison, but it is the one being made online. And so if we translate that into reality, it's something much more akin to the ROK-US strategic agreement. If you wanted to be very cynical, you could say it would be the US-Taipei agreements. understanding, strategic ambiguity, etc. But there's something more akin to that than actually AUKUS, obviously.
I personally think, and I don't like this comparison or analogy for a number of reasons. I honestly think that perhaps the best, if not the ideal comparison, is U.S. policy with regard to Israel, simply because of the fact that we have made massive investments in supporting their indigenous defense industrial capability as a way to tie them to us policy-wise in terms of international relations.
If I'm being brutally honest, a U.S.-Israel style relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine would be well ahead of my expectations of what happens in the medium term. I'd be thrilled if that was the case.
And to be clear, I'm not in any way advocating that as the actual end state of the political relationship between the U.S., Ukraine, and the rest of Europe. I'm speaking strictly from sort of a defense industrial policy standpoint, where we essentially massively subsidize the Israeli defense industry to the tune of several $billion annually.
All right. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I think if this war ever gets to the point where Ukraine pushes Russia out of Ukraine, I don't see how the war would actually end there unless just everyone jumped in Ukraine and said, like, okay, Ukraine's free now, and like we're gonna put our army on the border to make sure. Like there's got to be like there has to be some third party that jumps in, or I think the war would just last like literally forever.
I mean, to be brutally honest and realistic, and again, I'm drawing from my preferred academic sources, and you can absolutely call me out for, appeal to authority here. There's not going to be a consensual territorial settlement in the near future. That's the reality right now. And so in terms of comparisons, comparable examples, we're looking at the Korean Peninsula. We're looking at the Republic of China versus the People's Republic of China. We're looking at different settlements in the first 15 to 20 years of the Cold War, whether that is from on one end of the spectrum, the Malay Peninsula, to the other end of the spectrum, Indochina, or quite topically, Israel-Palestine. In terms of the structure of territorial settlements, its legality, its the degree to which it is recognized legally and formalized. And so I think the political future of Ukraine is the most immediate term attainable goal for those who support the future of Ukraine determined by the majority of Ukrainian people. And I hate to be cynical, but that's how I see it.
I think if that is the outcome, then this is just we're getting one step closer to a global war, honestly. Because that's an unstable outcome. It's just going to slide downhill from there.
I would love to tell you how wrong you are and how that's definitely not the case, but that is definitely a factor. The optimist case in this example would be the Korean Peninsula, right? So frozen in the early 1950s and stable, quote unquote, aside from a few, tree chopping crews ever since, and a few shells either way, and a few defectors. The bear case would be Indochina, obviously stabilized, quote unquote, again in the mid 1950s, and immediately back to a hot but not hot conflict in the early 1960s. So I don't pretend that there's an abundance of good options here, but from a realist point of view, that's how I see it. I hope I'm wrong.
Well, I just think you're going to end up with war in Asia. I think the war is just going to pivot to Asia. So, like, I don't think they're just gonna say, "Oh, we're done with Ukraine." I think they're just gonna be like, "Okay, then who's next on the chopping block? Are we gonna go to like Kazakhstan? Like, where are we going next?"
The two things.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, John. Go ahead, John.
No, what I was just going to say briefly is I think at least setting aside, any Russian territorial ambitions in Central Asia or elsewhere for the moment, in terms of just strictly Ukraine and Europe, I think that, if Ukraine can, reclaim all of its territory to its sovereign borders, I think that we will reach an equilibria. What that equilibria looks like is uncertain. I think that there are 2 to 3 possible pathways here. The first, and in no particular order, the first is Ukraine develops an independent nuclear deterrent. The second is Ukraine accedes to NATO, and there is a deployment of U.S. and other NATO ally forces to Ukraine. In a permanent basing agreement like we have with other NATO members. 3, which is basically 2 with the added component of a deployment of U.S. nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I suspect it will end in one of those 3 equilibria. I think the ideal one, the ideal one's obviously 3. Alternatively, 1 is also doable. I suspect it'll end up either being 1 or 3 eventually, or at least in terms of the outcomes that the Ukrainian government would prefer. I suspect it would be either outcome 1 or outcome 3. Again, outcome 3 is the best for everybody, but I suspect they will pursue some level of direct nuclear security, either by having a nuclear deterrent themselves, or by having the U.S. deterrent physically in Ukraine. I suspect that is the equilibria that this conflict will trend towards, if Ukraine is in a position to liberate all of its territory beforehand.
Just touching on John's comment there, my goal, just to be 100% clear, my goal, my desired outcome, is the complete restitution of Ukraine's territorial integrity, its sovereignty, reparations paid by the aggressor, and war criminals brought to justice. That's what I'm here for. That's what I assume we're all here for. If that is not entirely attainable, the question remains a positive political future for Ukraine without conceding 1 inch of Ukrainian sovereign territory, formally, but frozen conflict where Russia continues to occupy Ukrainian sovereign territory. But Ukraine is integrated into the Western political, economic, and defense infrastructure, whatever form that may take, versus continued active, continuous kinetic conflict, where that is not the case. It's not for me to decide that. I have my biases. It's for the Ukrainian people to decide that. But I think that's a question that's going to need to be answered and will be answered in the next 18 to 24 months.
So we have a question for you, John. What do you think would happen first? Ukraine liberating itself, or Ukraine getting nukes?
Oh God. So on the bright side, most Ukraine's uranium deposits are not in occupied territory. Thankfully, they are mostly like north of Kryvyi Rih, which isn't great. It'd be better if they were like in Zakarpattia, but at least they're on the other side of the Dnipro. That out of the way, I don't know. It's a very tricky situation to undertake a nuclear weapons program before all of their territory is liberated, for a couple reasons. The first is that the U.S. is going to lose its mind, and there is a substantial risk, I would say probably in excess of, there's a 75% plus probability that if they pursue that, we will terminate all security assistance to them immediately. The U.S. will likely aggressively pursue counter-proliferation measures against them, punitive measures. So they have that to weigh against it. How much are they willing to risk compromising the short term to medium term? And medium term is really on the order of years here. situation on the front lines to have a pathway to a more favorable long-term security environment. That's really the fundamental trade-off is, if they lose US security assistance, can they continue to hold the line? And B, do they want to take the risk of, well, if we continue to receive US security assistance as is, even though it's woefully inadequate to our need, do we want to continue to try and have this probability of retaking our territory? Or do we want to essentially let that go to zero in exchange for the long-term security of what we currently hold? That's a very bad situation. Obviously, we do not want to put them in that position. That's the last position that we want to put them in. But if in this notional scenario, that would essentially be the calculus that they're having to work with. I don't know where they would come down on that. I suspect they would probably lean towards not doing so, particularly with the current administration in Ukraine. I'm not sure they're willing to risk that much in terms of security assistance from the US and the UK, obviously other allies and partners, to make that decision right now. Just simply because, and again, it's not even just the security assistance, it's the humanitarian and direct financial assistance. If that collapses, well, they will, become completely insolvent. Well, more so than they already are. And that it's a gamble, and I don't think that they're willing to take that level of risk with the front lines currently as they are.
Just to add my 2 cents, I worked a lot in grad school on proliferation theory and policy. I cannot imagine a situation in the near to medium term, let's call that 4 to 6 years, where you see Ukrainian proliferation, or to be accurate, reproliferation, the first nation to reproliferate. You'll see Saudi Arabia proliferate before you see Ukraine reproliferate in nuclear terms. That's a different question from guarantees with implicit or explicit or in between guarantees from the US as a nuclear power on Ukrainian security and territorial integrity. I mean, if you had an agreement tomorrow, and this would not happen for 10,000 reasons, but if tomorrow they came out and they said, here's the line, here's where we agree, we're not recognizing each other's territorial claims, but conflict's frozen, US security guarantee with implicit nuclear backing on further Ukrainian territorial integrity. That's possible. An actual independent Ukrainian nuclear deterrent within the foreseeable future, I don't see it. The cost-benefit analysis doesn't merit it.
Well, what I would say is that the hurdle for the Ukrainians would be, I suspect, not on the R&D side, to be honest. I suspect they depending on how much technical data they retained from the Soviet nuclear weapons program, I don't think from a design standpoint, proliferating would actually be that significant a challenge for them. It would be developing the industrial capacities to support the industrial scale production of nuclear components that would be necessary to actually support a viable and credible nuclear deterrent. I mean, setting up the uranium mining industry, setting up enrichment and processing, setting up plutonium breeding reactors, setting up pit production, all this other stuff. That would be where the pressure point is from them. I think that's that's radically different from, I think, the Saudis, where they may have more issues with the technical side, where the Ukrainians, they can probably draw on a wealth of remaining Soviet weapons data that they possess, I would assume.
No, they have the data. I'm working on the base case of a U-238 proliferation. You could do it with plutonium too. Raw materials and centrifuges are huge gaps to bridge without detection and, shall we call it, intervention from third parties, which we've seen, from Israel with Iran, just how effective taking out a few people, a few locations with Natanz, with air gapping that into Natanz that the US did. Just the number of single points of failure that dot the proliferation timetable are numerous. And so, take a U-238 timetable, and there's a lot of points of intervention for third parties. By third parties, obviously, I mean Russia. And it's a very long timetable. They have the technological know-how. On Saudi, the classic line that people who poo-poo Saudi proliferation say is, Saudi's never mass-produced a car. They can't create a nuclear deterrent. Well, Pakistan's never mass-produced a car either, and they have a nuclear deterrent. It's a bit of a fallacy that you need this broad, deep industrial base in order to develop an independent nuclear capability. You don't. You need a very specific knowledge set, skill set from scientists, and a very specific supply chain and industrial capacity. Outside of that, it's very achievable.
Do you want to change topic now?
Happy to.
Okay. So we have this article. And the topic of the article is smuggling. So what do you want to tell us about smuggling?
So, this article, which hopefully most people here have access to, I think is informative, not because the reporting is brilliant. It's very good reporting. Max Seddon's a great reporter, as is his co-author, Chris Cook. I assume most people listening to the stream have encountered Max Seddon at some point on Twitter, right? FT correspondent in Moscow, air quotes. Very well informed, very, very good commentary. It paints a picture, without going through it line by line, of the network of companies, shell companies, and intermediaries set up at the behest of the Russian state in order to acquire semiconductors, microchips. And it shows just how easy it is to use, and I'm going to use this term loosely, neutral third parties to acquire such technology. And neutral third party can apply to anything from the UAE, which I think most of us would consider a quote-unquote neutral third party, to the Republic of Ireland, which by all means should be a Western party. It's not in NATO, it is in the EU. They have a very unique record, shall we say, diplomatically, with historically the Soviet Union and other authoritarian regimes, and now with Vladimir Putin's Russia. But it really highlights, without going into the granular detail, and I don't think there's any use in that. I mean, there's a graphic in the article that shows how one actor is able to move through 5 different shell companies to quite easily move nominally sanctioned components into Russia. This current regime is not going to stop Russian acquisition. It can impede it. It can delay it. It can hamper it, but it cannot stop it. The global financial system is too interconnected, it's too globalized to simply interdict at a country's border, unless you had true global unanimity, which of course we don't. And so, when looking at Western strategy for interdicting Russia's ability to wage its war of aggression in Ukraine, we need to be smart. We need to be realistic. Simply sanctioning Russian companies, Russian acquirers, is not going to completely cut off the supply. What it is going to do is it's going to cost them time and money, and yeah, that's great, but it's not going to interdict the supply, especially not if they have willing third parties, both within the EU and within East Asia. And that continues to be the case. If I were the czar, to use a ironic term, I guess, of EU sanctions or EU-US sanctions policy, I would focus much more on general divestment than specific, sanctions on different inputs within the industrial chain. Because the quote, I forget which British government official it was, maybe it was Stanley Baldwin in the 1930s. One bomber will always get through. One shipment of microchips will always get through to Russia. If you want to defeat Russia on the economic front, you need to defeat them on the macro front, not the micro front. You need to make the proposition of their aggressive war in Ukraine unfeasible in the long term, and their ability to fund themselves, fund their state, fund their war effort. buy off the voters with public services in order to maintain political compliance. You're not going to do it in terms of cutting off access to specific components. You should still take those measures, but you should not focus on those measures as war winning, because they're not. One bomber will always get through. One shipment will always get through. Especially if you have the relationship that Russia has with interested third parties, mentioning no China's. So that's my overview, Constantine. Happy to take questions. Sorry, Andrew. I was looking at Constantine's comment from earlier as I said that. I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. So, I know a lot of people are very frustrated about this. Like yesterday, I think it was yesterday. There were some articles about how like European countries were sending things to third party states, and a lot of people were very angry, like very angry. And I feel like a lot of people feel that the companies that are doing it are the ones who should be punished. Like if you're selling to some random third party like 10,000 times more than you used to, or than you did like last year, like people feel like that company like making the money should be held accountable. But that doesn't seem to be the way we do anything. So I don't know if you want to talk about that.
There's always going to be egregious cases, right? And so you saw this with, to name a very, very few companies. I could name a lot more, but Unilever is one. BP was another. Both of those, by the way, have since corrected. But in 2022, both of those spent a lot of time delaying divestment and essentially, turning off of Russian businesses that they had for what appeared to be only financial or political reasons. There was no genuine reason. There are genuine reasons, by the way. If you have 3,000 people who work in Finland selling your products into Russia and you want to make sure that you don't leave those people without a paycheck, that's a genuine reason to wait a few months. But after a year, it's not so much a genuine reason. So there were companies who were clearly egregious at the beginning and still are. Very, very, very few left in the West who are quite egregious. What's moving the needle much more is just the anonymous nature of international finance and the fact that you're selling to a shell company from a shell company who then sells to a shell company, all of which may be based in the Marshall Islands or the U.S. Virgin Islands or Delaware or Monaco without any clear proof of beneficial ownership, which a lot of jurisdictions withhold, who the beneficial owner is. So it's a quite tricky situation. And you have two choices. You can try and play whack-a-mole and find every company that's making the wrong sale to the wrong party at the wrong time and penalize them. And that would be just. You would be doing justice, but it would be very ineffective because another shell company of a shell company would pop up. Or you could take the macro approach to generally isolate Russia. And that would involve geopolitical, diplomatic arrangements that may be unsavory to some or many of us in China, in India, in Saudi Arabia, and on. And that will be much more effective, but much less targeted. And so that's the dichotomy of Russia's economic situation. Put yourself in the situation of, not Navalny, who's the head of the Central Bank of Russia and who is hated by most of the inner Kremlin circle, but put yourself in the situation of a, Putin apparatchik whose duty is to talk up the Russian economy. You've got an election next year. You have said publicly through Peskov that the Russian ruble will be at 80 rubles per dollar by election day. You're halfway there. You're going to mortgage the country and your people's future to get it there, but you'll get it there. They're thinking very short term. They're thinking in very tangible data points. how can we interfere with those data points? How can we undermine their targets in the short term? Even if it's cheap, even if it's cutting corners. That's where I'd focus. I can go on that, but I'll pause there.
John, do you have any question?
Yeah, to add on to that, the other thing to consider, and Ipsum was talking about this a minute ago, with we can't sanction every avenue of potential import just due to how globalized the economy is. But beyond that, it's not even that there's so many avenues for us to attempt to have to target with sanctions, primary or secondary. It's that there's some avenues that we can't target because of political considerations. And I'd say that probably Turkey and the UAE are the best examples of this. We have quote unquote allies nominally that are in it for purely pragmatic reasons. They're more than happy to play both us, the Russians, the Chinese, whoever. We can't necessarily simply lock them down with secondary sanctions, like we would like to, because of the fact that they offer us things that are politically valuable to us. I mean, Turkey's obviously a member of NATO, a quite substantial one, particularly regarding events in the Middle East and North Africa, and obviously, control of the Bosphorus and access to the Black Sea. The UAE is obviously very important for, again, our foreign policy in the Middle East, and with regard to Iran, general security in the region, etc. We can't just go alienating all of the countries that we have materially significant security and political relationships with, because that will end up undermining our national security and foreign policy, in other areas of the globe, even if it does serve a meaningful purpose in assisting the Ukrainian war effort by degrading the Russian one. There is a limit to how far we can push that realistically. So it's not even just that we can't, identify and sanction all the potential avenues. There's some that we can identify that we know are happening. It's happening right in front of our eyes. We're watching it again, Turkey, the UAE, etc. We just politically can't do anything about it because, they have us over a barrel because they provide things to us that we need for reasons separate to what's occurring in, with Ukraine and Russia. And I think Sir Duch going to add on something as well.
I guess not.
I did. I was struggling to find the unmute button because I'm an idiot. Again, it's further to the point. If you have a hostile state actor like Russia or however many other hostile state actors there may be who are willing to compromise on the use of high-end production and directly controlled military grade or military disk controlled processors and other components and utilize dual use and commercial components, it also becomes much more difficult because then any state that aligns itself with that hostile actor in any way, shape or form, or sits in a quote unquote neutral way, much like, we talked about Saudi, India, UAE, China. If you're exporting dual use technology and goods, software, it becomes much more difficult to stop that from ending up in the hands of a hostile state actor that you've sanctioned for those goods, because you can't stop the export of dual use goods to every country who might possibly send them onwards to, in this case, Russia. I've seen multiple comments about mountains of washing machines and tumble dryers on the borders of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and scrapyards, and there's various poetic license taken with the description of that, but it's absolutely true that there is evidence of that Russia is willing to compromise on the quality of things like chips and circuits, etc., and processors and circuit boards, but by taking them from commercial export products. So, from the UK perspective, what do we do? Do we suddenly stop, the export of all household white goods to any of the stands in the event that any of the electronics inside them may be taken out and repurposed for military technology? How do you control that globally? It's an impossibility. There's always going to be some form of proliferation. So it sort of links back to what Ipsum was saying.
speaking as someone whose job is trade compliance and sanctions compliance, it's got to be focused much more on the financial, I think.
Just touching on that point, it's I'm sure some of you have seen Viktor Malenko, the Soviet fighter pilot who defected from the USSR in the 1970s, died this week. He defected with, let me just make sure I get these stats right so I don't get corrected. It was a MiG-25P Foxbat from Vladivostok to Japan, gave it to the US. When he defected with that fighter, the MiG-25P was seen as a game-changing airframe by the US. A game-changing Soviet airframe. Then they analyzed it for the first week, and it was seen as nothing more than, quote, a US defense official, a rocket with wings. We were concerned about nothing. In the second and third weeks before they returned the fighter to the Soviet Union in pieces, obviously, and they actually started taking some of the more advanced components apart, they realized, actually, this is a pretty advanced airframe powered by IBM components. So this airframe that the US in the 1970s had been quite worried by was not as advanced as the US had worried about once they got their hands on it. But it was still pretty advanced, but only on the back of US technology. And that's a reality. If you are a free trade nation, that's a reality. You cannot stop that with high confidence. If you are trading with countries around the globe, that technology will get into the hands of countries that you don't wish it to, even if you sanction those countries, even if you block trade with those countries. And so how do you operate within that environment? And it has to be not on the micro, not blocking an IBM component that, is the basis of the radar of the M25P, but of isolating the Soviet Union in terms of their ability to maintain their military-industrial complex, as the West did in the 1980s. And that means making bargains with people who are less than perfect, as all nations are. But it's also important to remember that very, very, very few financial arrangements of this nature are made on a state-to-state level. Some are, but most aren't. Most are made between a refinery in Texas and an Aramco subsidiary in Saudi Arabia. They're not made between the Saudi state and the US government. And so if you view it like that, it's about giving incentives, both politically and economically. And doing that's going to require a great deal of political effort from the US administration, and I don't see it. I see it somewhat from the State Department, but if I'm being brutally honest, I don't see it from within the White House, specifically the Office of the National Security Advisor. There's a reluctance to take on that burden.
One other thing I'd add, and this is slightly unrelated, I just because it comes up in Twitter and other online arguments and discourse so often about defense production and the why it costs the U.S. or at least appears to cost the U.S. So much money to manufacture specific weapon systems, be it expendable munitions, tanks, aircraft, etc. I don't think that people realize the amount of money and resources that goes into validating particularly electronic components, as well as just, suppliers of components and subcomponents for these systems in general, both in terms of, doing security audits of the, downstream or the upstream source, I suppose, of these components from, a personnel standpoint, ensuring that they are, don't have foreign spies working for them, to ensuring the, physical robustness, the reliability, doing proper QC and QA on the things that they produce that get fed into the supply chain supporting the defense industrial base. All this validation, verification, certification, accreditation across the board for all these different things costs a lot of money. And that's one of the reasons why things oftentimes appear much more expensive than you might expect them to. and why efforts to scale production often take longer than you might expect them to just on the surface, because there's all this back end stuff that has to go on to make sure you are getting a reliable, secure product, in whatever context, is applicable.
I would just add, while we're talking about the Russian economy in general, I shared this with you, Andrew, earlier in the week, but I think it's an underreported story in general, is the refusal of the Chinese government to sign the Power of Siberia 2 agreement with Russia. And just as a refresher for anyone listening, Russia's natural gas exports to Europe were its main moneymaker. Oil's great, natural gas was their bread and butter. And those natural gas exports to Europe came through pipelines, as we all know. Pipelines through Poland, pipelines through Ukraine, and undersea pipelines such as Nord Stream 1 and 2. That market is effectively dead. Now, there's still liquefied natural gas exports from Russia to European countries, but the pipeline market is effectively dead. Not completely, but effectively. And those gas fields in northern Siberia that Russia controls have no link by pipeline to any other market. Their goal, their only way of funding themselves and their expenditures long term, is by taking those gas fields and finding a way to sell those to China. There's two ways to do that. One, you can build out massive liquefied natural gas capacity, which means liquefaction terminals on the Russian end and gasification terminals on the consumer end, China, India, etc. That takes 10 years and a lot of money. And China is less than willing to make that investment. So the alternative, option 2, is pipelines. Build a new pipeline from those gas fields that doesn't lead to Europe, but leads to China. Russia has put essentially all chips on black, betting on this. And 2 years ago, Russia said, here we go. Power of Siberia 2 will link these gas fields, instead of linking them to Europe, now it's to the Chinese market. Well, what's the follow-up? Has it been signed? Is it under construction? No. And now, a week ago, South China Morning Post reports China has no interest in signing this agreement. This is a body blow to the Russian economy. I'm not going to sit here and predict the exact territorial outcome of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Others can do that better than I, and even those are going to be guesstimating at best. But what I can say is that Russia forfeited its primary financial asset and will not be able to get that back for the foreseeable future. Even if China were to sign the agreement tomorrow, that's 10 years before it comes online, before that gas is actually delivered in volume, and before they actually start to bank those revenues. And that's a body blow to the Russian state. Period.
So, is there a real reason China is against buying from Russia? Because they seem to have always been against it, but I honestly don't really understand why. Is it are they just more interested in the Middle East? Like
it's state interest.
Okay.
Nothing more, nothing less. I was watching a clip. I can send it to you if you want, from Richard Nixon, speaking in the 1980s about the negotiations of the 1970s between the U.S. and China, where he said, people view the world through a doctrinal lens, right? The Soviet Union is Marxist-Leninist. China is Marxist-Leninist. The U.S. is capitalist. Therefore, first two should cooperate against the third party. But at the end of the day, what Kissinger found out, is China's lens for engaging with the world is what benefits China. As a state, as a people, that's a very complex issue about differentiating those two. We don't have time to go into that, but it's a question of raison d'etat, state interest. A very different lens than that with which the Soviet Union, especially early on, viewed the world. And a very different lens than that which the US, especially early on in the Cold War, viewed the world, which was ideological. China will do what is best for China. And you can debate and parse what the difference between what's best for the Chinese Communist Party versus China and its people. That's not the discussion we're having. It's a question of how does Chinese policy, the policy of the state that represents the majority of the Chinese people, get made, and it's what's in China's interest. And at the end of the day, they can buy much cheaper gas with zero upfront investment from Qatar, from Mozambique, from Venezuela, slightly, that's mostly oil, but slightly natural gas. And they will continue to do so. It's the opposite of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Where Belt and Road Initiative, China goes to Pakistan, to Sri Lanka, to Kenya, and says, I'll build you a port for this debt. I know you can't pay this debt back. Well, here's the collateral. If you can't pay this debt back, I own the port. And that's why Mombasa, Colombo, Karachi, all owned, the ports there are all owned by Chinese SOEs.
Yep. I mean, I have questions about that, but that's a completely different topic. I don't really want to get to. Yeah. We have a lot of debate in the chat over whether things are traceable. I think the point here isn't whether Russia is smuggling things. It's that it's too hard to stop them from smuggling. It's not that we're trying to find out whether they're smuggling, because we know they are. It's that we can't stop it is the issue. It's too expensive to stop them. And I think that's what the people in the chat are missing, because they're like, oh, of course we can find out if they're smuggling. Like, yeah. We're like, yeah, we know they're smuggling, okay? Like, that's not the issue.
So here's what I would say. First off, I'm happy to take that conversation, whether it's here or whether we do it in a different stream or just online, you and me. I'm happy to have the conversation about the role of China more generally. But in terms of stopping Russian smuggling, here's a very crude analogy. Every analogy is crude, right? It's not perfect, but here's a crude analogy. You're playing a game of whack-a-mole. For people who haven't spent time in the US, whack-a-mole is a game where you have a plastic hammer, and little moles pop up in different holes, and you have to hit the one that pops up as it comes up. So you can play the game of whack-a-mole where you try and hit the little mole that pops up, or you could just unplug the machine. What I'm advocating is just unplugging the machine, rather than trying to hit every mole as it comes up out of the hole.
So
Just to add to that, from an industry perspective, we spend an awful lot of time and money doing denied party screening and supply chain compliance. You know, there's an element of due diligence in there for anyone who's working on any number of contracts as part of business ethics and compliance. And there are a number of software providers out there, and a lot of the business of procurement certainly within controlled goods areas is about doing that due diligence on the supply chain. So it's not as if efforts aren't being actively undertaken to prevent any kind of proliferation or smuggling. You know, it's a huge amount of effort is already being done, which should give you an idea for the lengths that Russia and other hostile actors go to circumvent any controls or checks.
So I guess, well, can you give a firm example on what you mean by cutting off Russia?
Yeah. So here's something that's quite doable, and would not require inordinate political or economic will. And what you could do is you could essentially pass certain EU would be the best. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself. You have to think where you are making these rules. Is it the G7? Is it the EU? Is it the UN? Et cetera, G20. It's not the G20. It's not the UN, for sure. G7 versus EU, you have a debate. What you could do on the EU front is you could reject Russian LNG. Is that going to make Russia unable to sell its liquefied natural gas? No, of course not. They'll sell it to other buyers. but it's a good first step in lowering the aggregate demand for that specific good. And even if Russia sells its LNG to India, and then India sells that same LNG back to Europe, India making the difference on the spread, you're at least letting India make the difference on that spread rather than Russia doing it. Another one you could do is peel off India and to some degree China in a broader macroprudential arrangement around IMF funding. And that's a whole rabbit hole. So we've all seen what happened in Argentina, I assume, with Milei taking power. It's someone who was born in the US and was raised in the UK and is a rabid UK patriot, seeing the Argentine president-elect essentially endorse the British position on the Falklands and quote Thatcher as a hero. Yeah, that warms my heart, but that doesn't actually make a difference on the ground. What actually does make a difference on the ground is what Milei said on dollarization, on the central bank, on working with the IMF. And China has bet a lot of political and financial capital on being an alternative provider of last resort, for countries in need. If you can pull China into a alternative third-party arrangement, call it a JV, joint venture between the New Development Bank and the IMF, that's a huge difference. The more you can isolate Russia's ability to take international financial capability and smack a Russian flag on it, the better you're doing. The better you're doing, not just in Argentina, but the better you're doing in Niger, in Chad, in Mauritania, in Mali, in Guinea, all the countries where Russia's influence is essentially the raison d'etre of Russian being there. There's many steps you can take, but the first and foremost that I would take is co-opting their potential partners in these financial arrangements. Does that make sense?
Yes. It's something that this is get back to that the Chinese thing is I really don't understand why we haven't been doing that more, like way more than we have been doing, is going to these countries and kind of bringing them to our side with money, basically.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, you don't even need to. I mean, it's not a question of bribery, and it's not even a question of outbidding China. It's a question of making yourself a more attractive long-term partner than China. Because I spent the 2010s in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, in especially South Africa, Zambia, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Uganda. Other states to some degree, but those 4 states mainly. Working with governments, working with local entrepreneurs, working with local financial institutions. That was my job. And the entire time I was asking my counterparties, how do you see the influence of China? How are you banking this? How are you accounting for this? What's your plan along these lines? And they all smiled at me, whether it was in Lagos, whether it was in Kigali, whether it was in Johannesburg, Pretoria, whether it was in Lusaka, and said, hey, they're the high bid. And that was the reality. I drove from Kampala to Entebbe, and every single stop along the highway, a factory was written in Chinese letters. That's the influence of China in Africa. They are the main employer on margin. They are the main buyer on margin. You go to Mozambique, it's the same question. You go to Angola, good Lord, it's the same question. So if you're looking at Chinese influence, you're not going to compete with that. The US does not need manufacturing capacity in Uganda. It does not need timber rights in Mozambique. The US has Nebraska for corn. The US has Maine for timber. We don't have the same need that China does. So there's a very good argument to work with China and say, listen, this is very important for you. You can't replicate Mozambican timber exports. You can't replicate Ugandan manufacturing capacity domestically, and you can't replicate Madagascar. What's the possessive term of Madagascar?
I have no idea.
It's really weird.
It's Malagan, right? Malagan?
Yeah, exactly.
You can't replicate Malagan agricultural capacity in China. That's fine. You work with these states on a bilateral basis, no problem. But on big issues about trade settlement, about rule of law between two states, we work together. And there's been a huge reluctance in the Obama administration, in the Trump administration, and in the Biden administration to do that. And if you look in Europe, David Cameron in the UK was quite eager. George Osborne was quite eager to do that. Angela Merkel was quite eager to do that. Their records have been stained for different reasons. But it's going to come down to, at some point, to some degree, a question of accommodation with China at the expense of Russia. And I know where I stand on that. I'll leave it to the rest of the electorate of my country where they stand on that. But yeah, I'll accommodate with China to isolate Russia. It's going to be a political question. And we see this in Spain. We see this in Italy. We see this in France. Unresolved question in all three countries. It's somewhat resolved in the UK and Germany. But in the other big economies of the EU, it's quite unresolved. And even in the US, where there's much more political accommodation on the China question, you don't have a real pro-China lobby in the US. Even there, it's up for grabs. Anyway, that's my spiel.
Yeah, I don't know, John. We seem to have a big movement in the upper levels of the United States that's very anti-China, I think. I don't know.
We do. To put it mildly, they are, just objectively speaking, a gargantuan national security threat to us on uncountably many levels. So, correspondingly, rationally, as one would expect, there is a very strong anti-China lobby here from really across the political spectrum.
John, what's APT-1 stand for?
Advanced Persistent Threat 1.
And where would that be located?
In China.
It would. And so the exercise was a demonstration of the fact that I have no illusions about the threat that China poses to U.S. and U.S. interests. It's very real. But at the end of the day, you have to take a realist perspective. Right?
Yes. And the other thing I would point out is, to make it even more clear, they are explicitly developing weapon systems whose only conceivable purpose is to be able to prosecute targets in the continental United States conventionally.
Well, we do pretty similar things, don't we?
Yes, but those systems have many other uses, and that we can use them in many other countries. Theirs have conventionally armed ICBMs, conventional FOBs, fractional orbital bombardment system. All of those things. The only conceivable reason China would need those is to prosecute targets in the continental United States. That's the only purpose they could conceivably serve. Just as an example, if someone's making a point, I interrupted. My bad.
You reinforced my point. I appreciate it. You reinforced it very well. It's great power conflict, and this is where I really get frustrated. And I'm sorry if I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here. I've two of my college roommates were physicists, and I'm not going to take the time, your time, or anyone else's, to look up exactly which physicists they were talking about. But they compared that physicist who taught them quantum theory, which works very well in the classroom, but not at all in laboratory experiments, to John Mearsheimer. Basic cookie-cutter realism. It helps you understand the basic principles. It's not at all applicable. And at the end of the day, you need to be able to make a realist case for cooperation with China for the negation of Russia without necessarily or in any way endorsing Mearsheimer's broader, quote-unquote, offensive realism ideology. Triangulation is possible without necessarily falling into what I'll call the Mearsheimer trap. And fans of Thucydides hopefully will appreciate that reference.
Okay, so does anyone have anything to add? Gick, do you have anything to say?
Gick's got to have something.
Sure he does. Probably not the Buddha talk, though.
Well, if neither Gick nor Exit nor Serdushka have anything else to add, I'll say one more thing. But I'm going to wait 10 seconds for Gick to speak.
We have one question from the audience. It is, what is the best way for countries to support both Taiwan and Ukraine?
Beyond the ballot box, the best way is to, as an individual citizen, is to invest in whatever way you can in your own domestic capabilities. France being better at manufacturing nuclear submarines, as they are very glad to tell everyone they can do, is a good step that a French citizen can take. Right? And a UK citizen who develops new networks, new protocols for different cyber integrations, possibly yielding at some point a 0-day vulnerability, that's a good step to take. So the short answer is patriotism.
All right. Well,
the only other thing I'd add on to that is, to Ibsen's point, it's, really just how you go about making, I guess, the labor and works of your life where you choose to apply those. And, if that's the kind of difference that you want to make, have that, obviously small individually, that level of impact on, global affairs and your country's standing in them. You obviously, you can choose to work in labor in those areas where it's directly relevant. The other thing is to, wherever you can, try to, especially if you are, by virtue of employment, wherever you live, etc., if you have the opportunity to develop, professional international connections, not just between, not just on an individual level between yourself and individuals and, say friendly foreign countries, but institutionally between your place of work to friendly foreign countries, neutral foreign countries, etc., in any way that you can foster both individual and institutional relationships internationally between, presumably good actors, wherever it is you live, and good actors overseas, that is beneficial as well. And obviously I'm aware, and I'm sure Ibsen's aware, that, not everybody is going to be in a position to do either that or to work in an area or have commitments in areas that are, directly relevant to these things. So again, mileage may vary. But if you are in a position to do that, or you can get to a position where you, are able to do that, and that's something that you're interested in doing, then that's certainly an avenue that you can choose to pursue.
I just posted links to you, Andrew, for two absolutely exceptional people. My two former professors, Jay Healy, who focuses on cyber warfare and conducts a number of open competitions for white hat hacking in terms of determining cyber warfare policy, former White House cybersecurity advisor, as well as Austin Long, now at the RAND Corporation, an advisor including to current Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Well, he was the NSA to Joe Biden when he was vice president on nuclear policy. These are two people who are making a difference, who are very influential, and who need people coming to them, volunteers for their different open source studies. So if you want to contribute, these are two people who need you.
Yeah, I put them in the description of the video. There's other stuff in the description as well. Some of the links to the articles, etc.
Full disclosure, Jay Healy gave me a B+ in one class, and it's still beef between us.
All right. So we've been going on for like 2 hours. I think that's quite enough. Thank you for coming and talking to us, John and Lorem Ipsum. And thank you to the audience who came in and listened and were active in the chat, especially about the ball bearings. They really enjoyed that part. They've also been debating a little bit of a NVIDIA debate, which I guess is somewhat related. In some ways.
It's very related, and anyone debating NVIDIA, you're welcome to ping me directly on Twitter. I'll happily engage. This stream is not the time or place to do it, but I'll happily have that conversation because it's a good one.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting going on with NVIDIA over the past few months regarding China, definitely. Anyways, thank you for everyone. I'm gonna stop the stream now because it's been 2 hours. All right, so see you later. If you like the video, you can share it with people. I'm sure a lot of people will find it interesting, something to listen to while at work or something. I don't know. There's things that people don't often talk about. People usually talk about other things like battles or missiles or whatever, and not so much the economics, which I find interesting personally, even though I know nothing about it. Anyways, right. So goodbye, everybody.